This is Season 1, Episode 24. You are listening to an After Dinner Conversation magazine podcast. After Dinner Conversation believes humanity is improved by ethics and morals grounded in philosophical truth, and that truth is discovered through intentional reflection and respectful debate. In order to facilitate this process, we've created a growing series of print books, a monthly short story magazine, and 2 different podcasts. This podcast, Philosophy, Ethics, Short Story Audiobooks, provides audiobook readings of stories that have appeared in our magazine, and our companion podcast, Philosophy, Ethics, Short Story Discussions, is where we discuss the ethics of the choices made in the stories as a way to model the kinds of discussions we hope you're having about these readings with friends, family, or students. We would love it if you'd go over and check it out. I'm Colby, your narrator and the creator of After Dinner Conversation Publishing. Thank you for spending your time listening to our podcast and for reading the magazine. Thank you for supporting us through your magazine subscriptions and through patreon.com/After Dinner Conversation. And of course, if you enjoy this audiobook reading, please subscribe to our podcast, share it on social media, and suggest it to friends. Today's story is by Sarah Johnson, and it appeared in our April 2021 magazine. The story is The Angel in the Juniper. Old Clyde Adamson was plotting with the Jacobin faction. Holly, who had studied under him only the subjects he taught on the side, Neo-Platonism in the early Church Fathers and classical drama, had hired on a month ago as his secretary and was now perfectly sure. It was disturbing. One couldn't deny that the present republic had degraded to the mere form of a representative government under the last president and his hand-picked parliament, but the Jacobins were dangerous, low-profile activists who had formally concluded that the governmental system no longer admitted renewal by legitimate means, and were preparing to incite even revolution to restore the principles of the 400-year-old Constitution. Holly didn't know yet how deeply Professor Adamson was involved with the faction or how high a member he might be. She felt sure that, with his broad scholarly reputation and influence, he could hardly fail to be a decisive force in the group. But the thought that the boss she so liked and respected could be a treasonist hardly alarmed her more than the inevitable gastric knowledge that this brilliant man knew, or would very soon know, that she knew, and would address the fact to protect himself and his party, somehow. That gastric knowledge turned to a squadron of armed butterflies when Professor Adamson came in that morning and said quietly, "Miss Granger, I wonder if I could ask you to join me on a stroll into Warble Wood this afternoon. I feel it's time I introduced you to someone there, someone closely involved in my work. Please don't be alarmed, Miss Granger. This can mean nothing personally harmful to yourself unless you voluntarily choose to undergo certain risks in support of a noble cause. You are under no threat or duress of any kind, only the invitation to learn about something you may consider important." While looking at his face, ever same, good-humored yet earnest, she could not fear or distrust, and agreed, but when he had gone to his lecture hall, could do both with a vengeance. She told Miss Parsley, the bursar, where she was going that afternoon and left a note instructing her to contact the police if Holly wasn't back by 10 p.m. No use if the police had found something more profitable to do, like arresting a dissenter, but supposing they hadn't. Afternoon came, and so did Adamson. "Take your coat, Miss Granger. And you have any heavier shoes? This is going to be rough." It was. Holly was surprised to find how well Adamson seemed to know his way. There was no path, and how vigorously the old man could forge through the thick brush and bracken of this less frequented part of Warbell Wood, a sylvan enclave that edged bustling old Fruit Market Square, but bottlenecked between two suburbs, eventually widened and stretched for miles into the hills. Holly thought herself athletic, but was frequently left several paces behind, gingerly poking at a spray of barbed hawthorn or caught by the stocking to a tough bramble. It was easier here amid a dense forest of dusty ferns. Holly kept easily by Adamson's side and could even join in conversation. She had caught scraps of commentary through the branches and knew he was trying to explain something about morality and the appeal to divine authority, but could only begin to pay attention now in mid-lecture. I'm saying this because very soon, in about 15 minutes, you'll meet a man who lives out here nearly all the time. Before I tell you what he does, I need to know your own conscientious view of the work of the Jacobin faction, with which you must be a little familiar. How do you... His voice trailed off through the foliage of a juniper while Holly was forced to stop and get a twig out of her shoe. She raised her head to call, "Please, wait a moment, sir," and didn't call. Holly had never seen an angel, but knew that one was sitting in the juniper tree. Flowing hair and broadly jawed, hardly female, hardly male, picked out in a dazzling clarity that made the surrounding greenery seem blurred. It reclined on the branch with the easy balance of a seagull, a figure which seemed spatially paradoxic. Compared to the branch, a miniature person, yet full of an aplomb that gave the impression of giganticism. Holly. She teetered a step nearer, still holding one shoe. "Adamson is a traitor of the worst kind, Holly. He has turned against his own nation and the government that provided for his career, and is even now coordinating an armed rebellion. To break out in a few days, he is leading you to a meeting with an even more dangerous conspirator." What? What can I do?" lisped Holly. "You must prevent the rebellion. Adamson's disappearance will paralyze the Jacobin communication network. You must kill him." Holly staggered to the juniper's trunk and leaned, panting. "Out here, before you get any closer to the radio shack where his accomplice works, where no one will hear a sound. Since he joined the rebels, he always carries a sharp, double-bladed hunting knife in the breast pocket of his coat. Very soon it will fall accidentally on the ground. Watch for it, snatch it without him seeing, then carry it secretly until you see a chance to thrust it under his ribs. Hide his body in the bushes, then walk downhill until you find running water, which will lead you out of the wood. In 2 weeks, the search for him will expose some of his incriminating papers, which will prove beyond the slightest doubt that he was on the verge of exciting revolt. It is then you must announce your deed and reveal his body. You will save the peace, and all the lives that might be lost by warfare. You will receive the praise and thanks of your nation, and with good reason." Holly pressed her closed eyes to the bark. "Go, Holly. Great matters depend on you. The time is short. God will speed and nerve you. Go, daughter." Hardly knowing what she was doing, Holly stumbled hastily through the branches, now following the voice she realized was Professor Adamson's, and which was calling her name again and again. "I'm coming, sir." "You're tired," exclaimed Adamson anxiously when she appeared through the boughs. "I've hurried you too much. I'm sorry, Miss Granger. I was anxious that we would not be followed. I felt you could be trusted. I know your strong conscience and your concern for good administration in the college and in my office, and I feel sure you must hate the abuses of the present legislation. Do you read the leftists by Socius, the anonymous Jacobin writer?" "I have, sir," murmured Holly, a disturbing memory. The little pink leaflets occasionally appearing overnight on doorsteps or park benches and eagerly collected by public-minded citizens before the police could confiscate them, contained very little political commentary, but only excerpts from the secret minutes of the current Parliament, which revealed how deeply rotted with bribery and nepotism the lawmaking body had become. The state's frantic efforts not to disprove but suppress their content was only too solid evidence of their accuracy. Something glinted on the ground. As soon as Adamson turned to thrust forward among the beech saplings, Holly unthinkingly caught up the fallen knife and clutched it under her coat against her pounding heart. "What do you think of Socius?" asked Adamson over his shoulder. "What do you think of his contentions?" Holly was too honest not to admit. I have found them very penetrating, sir, very well attested." "And you agree," grunted Adamson, holding back a branch to allow her to pass, "that our system of suffrage and referendum has been narrowed almost to preclude the chance of reorganizing Parliament or the presidency by legal means." This touched a sore place in Holly. Her own voting privilege had been revoked for life, like so many others, when she let her public pedestrian's license lapse for just 2 months. "I have to admit, it seems that way." "Do you love our nation, Miss Granger?" Adamson had stopped to look her in the face. "Do you want to see our ancient constitutional rights restored?" "Oh, how wonderful that would be. No more night raids, no more drafts of ruinous foreign wars without popular consent, no more arbitrary, commerce-withering tolls and taxes, old forbidden subjects taught again in the college. Oh, mercy, the angel, the knife." Holly trembled all over before she could catch herself. Adamson took her arm. "My dear, are you well? I've exhausted you. Sit down over here on this root." How he reminded her of her courtly old great-uncle Everard. How she wanted to confide her battle to the man she had just yesterday regarded as a pillar of dependability and wisdom. How could the angel call him a traitor of the worst kind? How much about him she must not know. If not for the angel, she would be utterly convinced by now that he was an ardent patriot and a humanitarian driven only to the possibility of violent revolt by a far more violent tyranny. But if God were on the side of the present regime... Sir, will you repeat what you were trying to tell me earlier about moral decisions and divine authority? I think I'm ready to listen. Gladly, Miss Granger. I was telling you about Socrates' Euthyphro dilemma. Basically, it states that moral laws are often said to rest on God's authority, as in the Bible. Yet it's conceivable that God could order someone to do something obviously immoral, as in the case of Abraham ordered to sacrifice Isaac, or even schizophrenics who believe a voice in their head telling them to commit crimes. This dilemma is often used in academia to discredit a religious approach to moral problems. The trouble is, in the absence of divine authority, all moral law becomes a social, even at a more basic level, neurological construct. There's no appeal to abstract ethics, only to more common or historically affirmed behaviors or patterns. Sometimes the appeal to species survival, which always beggars the simple question, why? So I remain a theist moral agent. You see, I got around Euthyphro long ago. How, sir? Murmured Holly, half unconsciously fingering a shape under her coat. Don't you see? The dilemma assumes that something or someone making a claim to be the creating mind good enough to overcome all reasonable doubt in the hearer demands an act which breaks the universally recognized moral laws every faith and culture attributes, or has attributed, to the deity. The laws that forbid murder and perjury, rape, infanticide, thievery, and vandalism, acts a culture's code must always go to extraordinary lengths to justify under any circumstances. Miss Granger, not all violence is immoral. In very unusual circumstances, passivity is immoral. I want you to think about that as we climb this hill, but the test of a so-called divine voice is rather simple. Nothing demanding a plainly immoral act can be the God who made the rules. God cannot change his mind by definition. All that's changeable is temporary, while that from which the temporary, changing world sprang must be eternal and changeless. Moreover, all evil itself is a secondary product, the perversion of an original good. The Creator, however, cannot be secondary but primary, therefore wholly good. Then what if, Holly was vexed and embarrassed to hear her own voice whine pleadingly, what if something that made every other claim, something outside and independent of the physical world, something, like you say, primary, independent of space and matter, suggested an act that only seemed, a little off, and you couldn't be sure what was really right? Wouldn't you be safer to obey? Wipe your face, you're perspiring, said Adamson, passing her a folded cotton handkerchief. I hurried you too much, I knew it. Holly buried her damp face in the cloth, then emerged as suddenly. Sir, my question. Is that even a question, Miss Granger? You aren't safer to obey an immaterial being. If we premise that God laid down moral laws, then you're safer to obey him or them, for they're the same. Holly felt herself at last on sturdy grounds of objection. Sir, I can't agree. You mentioned two necessary qualities of God, goodness, but also that independence of the changing temporary world. If a being is independent like that, it must follow from your own statements that that being is good. Her dizziness now is a different kind, not terror, but exaltation. She saw herself convincing the old academic that her heavenly messenger was legitimate. She saw herself avoiding murder by persuading him to fulfill the angel's command himself, by abandoning or betraying the Jacobins. Adamson reached and pulled towards himself a delicate huckleberry sprig, faintly smiling. Are you nearly ready to go on, ma'am? It's not far now. Perhaps you've gathered by now why we're climbing this great hill to reach our destination. Holly wasn't thinking about hills. Nearly ready, sir. A couple more minutes. Just tell me. If an obviously immaterial, independent, primary sort of being told you that, for instance, the Jacobin side was really in the wrong about our country's future, that leaving the current regime in place and trying to peacefully remove it were better, would you reconsider? Do you think I'd reconsider if you, sitting on that root, told me positively that the Jacobins were mistaken and that the regime were reformable, with no more supporting evidence? Just that. Seriously? Holly wanted for a second to hide her face again, then thrust her jaw out. But I'm not an angel. What difference? Haven't you ever heard that the devil is a perverted angel? Not all that's immaterial is God. Part of you is immaterial, but you're not God. She was not in a frame of mind to play exhaustion long, and jumped up. Well, if it's not far, let's go. Wait, Miss Granger, I mustn't. I can't reveal my contact out here or his work before I know where you stand regarding the work of the Jacobin Society. If you're against the prospect of violent revolt, I'll walk you back to town before it gets any later. I'm in favor, she blurted, turning a strained face toward another juniper tree. I'm in favor, she repeated more loudly, swinging her perspiring forearm toward him. Let's go. I'm not tired at all. But when he rose, she made an urgent gesture and took his arm. Adamson walked easily on the rising ground, lightly supporting her arm on his rigid elbow and sending earnest, good-humored glances over the hazel brush and young beeches, carrying his native land toward civil war with every stride, yet serene in the confidence of his own moral system, grounded upon a God he had never seen, in which he placed such confidence precisely because of the not seeing. And at his side scrambled Holly, keeping very near his ribs and trying to make her hand bring the knife from her coat and shove it under them, ever more feverishly convinced of the morality of the act, grounded upon a God she had seen, in which she placed such confidence precisely because of the seeing. The end. Discussion questions. Question 1. Professor Adamson references Euthyphro's dilemma, where Socrates asks Euthyphro, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? What does this phrase mean, and how does it relate to Holly's problem? Question 2. Like Abraham being asked to kill his own son, do we have an obligation to obey God even when it goes against our moral code? Question 3. Professor Adamson argues that God's morality is definitionally unchanging and timeless. Do you agree that morality, from God or otherwise, is unchanging and timeless? How does Holly's answer to the question affect her choice? Question 4. The story cites the mass removal of voting rights, night raids, rising taxes, and the near impossibility of legally changing the government. What, if anything, would be the last straw that would cause you to take up arms to violently overthrow the government? Question 5. Professor Adamson argues not all violence is immoral. In very unusual circumstances, passivity is immoral. Do you agree? Can you think of an example where passivity is immoral? Once again, thank you for listening to After Dinner Conversation. And of course, if you enjoyed this audiobook reading, please subscribe to our podcast, share it on social media, and suggest it to friends. And of course, you can always continue the discussions on our webpage in the comments section or on our Facebook page. Join us next week for the story On Our Hands. Have a wonderful day.